Now that most of Season 4 of Invincible is out, with the final episode slated to be released this Wednesday at the time of recording this video, it's time to talk about one of the most anticipated component that came with the hype train for this season, and that is Thragg, specifically his voice actor. Before it was officially confirmed who his voice actor would be, a lot of people were fan casting actor Ryan Hurst for the role. In fact, not only were people fan casting him, a lot of people were actively campaigning for his casting. But I feel like it got to the point where the fan base was deluding themselves into thinking there was a genuine chance he'd be cast, or at least that he'd be a contender for the part. Unlike Alan Ritchson, who both him and James Gunn have previously complimented each other in the same conversations when asked if they'd be interested in playing/casting him as Batman, Ryan Hurst, as far as I'm concerned, only had the backing of fans for any kind of shot at the role. People started pointing to the fact that Invincible loves to cast Walking Dead actors for the show, and Ryan Hurst played Beta in seasons 9 through 10, on top of people making edits of Thragg with Hurst's voice lines from God of War Ragnarok, where he plays Thor.
You seem like a calm and reasonable person, are you? A calm and reasonable person.
The hype train around him was, while entertaining, in hindsight, extremely pointless. And I'll admit, do I think he would have done a good job as Thragg? Absolutely. But do I also think/previously thought he could have gotten the part? Probably not. Because again, nothing really indicated that he was even considered for the part other than TikTok edits. So what we learned? We learned that it's your fault, Invincible fans, who hyped up this man to play a character he was never in talks to play, so you can't be upset when the studio doesn't cast him. I'm joking, obviously. But now that Lee Pace is in the role, and we have enough material to rate his performance, where would I put him? Well, that shouldn't really matter to you, now should it? Because it's my opinion, so what do you care about it? But to give you the opinion you didn't ask for, I'll give you my real answer and my diplomatic answer. My diplomatic answer is that I think he did a good job. You can feel that voice work was something he wasn't entirely accustomed to at first, so he had a rocky start. But once he got the handle of it, he managed to turn it around and deliver a performance that was satisfying. But if I were to go a little more in depth, the reality becomes a lot more complicated than that. When he was first announced to be playing Thragg, I was initially very excited to see him in action. And no, it wasn't just because he played Ronan in Guardians of the Galaxy, although I do think he doesn't get enough credit for that role. In general, I just really like him as an actor. He was one of the best parts of The Hobbit where he played Thranduil, I don't know, Legolas's dad, basically. But he also, in my opinion, was a standout in the show Foundation. The two statements I made before about his performance still stands, but a lot of the complaints I see made towards him is primarily his voice and the accompanying delivery of his lines. In the episode where the Viltrumites attack Telescria, we get the first true scenes with him where we actually hear lines of dialogue come out of his mouth. And naturally, people started to complain about this, saying that he doesn't sound intimidating in the slightest and that he's now on fraud watch. It's here where, again, the declaration of how Ryan Hurst would have done a much better job started to circulate. I already made fun of Invincible fans for having unrealistic expectations for fan castings, so I'm not going to repeat myself. Despite these complaints, after watching most of his performance, I will say that he met my expectations, and he has the potential to exceed them in future seasons. The main highlight of his performance was being able to provide a very methodical, tactical, supreme leader-like approach rather than just a wrath of anger and fury as people view him in the comics. Which I'd say is a much more realistic portrayal of what I'd imagine a space dictator to act like, since his performance also provides a good real-world comparison. Most real-life dictators and supreme leaders, both historical and current, are more in line with being characterized as calculating, patient individuals with their long-term goals and the journey to achieve those goals, leading to the suffering of hundreds of thousands to millions. As opposed to the erratic and impulsive sociopathic characters in popular media, where in some, when you see them, it becomes less frightening and more tedious when they are on screen as opposed to the former. I think Lee Pace did an excellent job at demonstrating that slow and calculating aura. The problem here is that people expected him to act like Kylo Ren from The Last Jedi, as a raging, wrathful, sadistic lunatic. And I know specifically they expected him to act that way because in every edit of him, both pre and post Lee Pace casting, has Ryan Hurst lines from Ragnarok where he's in full-on beast mode, as if Thor in that game was solely characterized by the words I previously used. And even with people defending his casting, they used the scene where Ronan takes the Infinity Stone for himself in the first Guardians movie to prove that he can go into beast mode. Characters like Tuco Salamanca, for example, who I think is one of the best representations of a full-on ballistic type villain, are only able to work in a couple of ways. The first would be they have limited screen time. There's only so much you can do with a character whose whole bit is to be the personification of the word rage. So even though they can provide significant contributions to the plot, if it isn't a character like Homelander where you're more watching the descent of a man into insanity, you need to place them in a specific place in the story if you want them for the long run. For characters like Homelander, they are placed in a specific part of the story to both provide the commentary intended by the writer and maintain an everlasting place on the show's cast that both contributes to the story moving forward and makes his outburst feel earned. When Homelander loses his mind, it feels like the show built up to this moment. For characters like the Joker, for example, that's more about the love for the game he has. He has no allegiance to anyone or any morality for that matter. He's just in it for the thrills and to mess Batman up big time, as both are two sides of the same coin. He's a storm that challenges Batman, and the best Joker stories are the ones that challenge Batman's morality to see how he's gonna make it out of it. Tuco, on the other hand, doesn't really have that. I'm sure the Breaking Bad crew could have figured out something to give him before having to kill him off. But since he left to make room for Gus Fring, what we have is one of the best representations of a purely rageful character. Someone who didn't really have much on his own, but was an instrumental step in providing a window into the grander underworld that was later explored in both Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, as well as providing pivotal character evolution for both Walt and Jesse in that show. But that specific achievement, as far as I'm concerned, can only be achieved with a character designed for the short term. I'm not saying it's impossible because in that same show Jesse was meant to die and look at where that took us. But when going back to Invincible, people were, and some still are, complaining that Thragg isn't intimidating enough. And while I understand those complaints because it is a fantasy superhero show, so you want your villains to have aura, from what we've seen so far, Pace is able to provide a sense of an organic, subtle, carefully constructed terror through supreme leadership of the Viltrumites, while also holding an immense allegiance to the twisted narrative the Viltrumites have formed for themselves as the universe's potente. And furthermore, in episode 7, we see Pace provide many moments of aura farming, and it actually has potential. The scenes of him unleashing his rage, from what I think, come from a place of authoritarian and tyrannical anguish rather than just a cosmetic. Now, I'm not saying that if Ryan Hurst got cast, that's exactly what it would have been, but I feel like the people who are complaining are only doing so because he isn't quote-unquote scary enough. Although this is a fantasy superhero show, some of the best superhero shows have villains who are terrifying not just because of any on-screen violence that they commit or take part in, but because they represent in some way or fashion the most depraved part that exists in reality. Part of the reason why Mark Hamill's version of the Joker is so good is because despite having moments of fantasism, for the most part, he's a normal guy. One of the only characters in the universe that has magic and sci-fi. He's the only one that's truly challenged Batman, and he's one of the more grounded characters in the whole universe. And while I wouldn't say Thragg is necessarily in the same category as the Joker, the show is attempting to provide more layers to the immovable mountain versus unstoppable force dynamic between Mark and Thragg. Now, will it succeed in that? We'll have to wait and see. But the only genuine issue I could find with Lee Pace was that it felt like he was uncomfortable at first with the voice acting because as far as I know, this is his first credit in such a role. I'm sure as he goes down the line, his acting will improve. But that's really all I have to say. Thanks for watching and yeah, peace.